thinking around what actually is an Agile team and how TED can be adapted to suit the needs of those Agile working teams. So what we're going to look at today is how TED can benefit those teams, how you might use the TED data, your TED report to support those teams, but also in terms of the objective of the session, it would be thinking around what areas might you want to focus on, or if an Agile team comes to you for some advice or maybe signposting to a TED resource, what are good go-to resources which can really work in an Agile, maybe in a remote feedback session or for a team that's working in an Agile fashion. So we're going to look at that through TED. We're going to look at some examples of different toolkits, but please feel free to share your own experiences, your own examples, if you've got any from teams that you've worked with. Okay, so first question, what do we mean by Agile teams? So when we think about this, there really are different ways of defining it. So I put that quote in the sort of circle on there around sort of the definition from teamwork.com is that it's a cross-functional, self-organized group of individuals who collectively share responsibility of delivering high-quality results in a timely manner, and they're constructed around those principles of Agile working. So it's about promoting that collaboration, which you mentioned in the chat, but also, I guess Agile is about being able to flex to different needs as well. So being able to flex either with the service that you provide or the needs of your team as well. So I think some of you mentioned in the chat around that work-life balance. So it might flex to accommodate that work-life balance, but it also might flex to meet your service needs and your customers or patients or whatever type of service that you're providing. So for Agile teams to be successful, they will be creating an environment where members do work independently. Maybe they're working frequently together, but they need to adapt quickly. And as we've already seen in the icebreaker, there are some definite benefits to that, but there are some real challenges when you're working in that Agile fashion. So important to sort of be clear on what I'm talking about here. Quite often when I mention Agile teams, you might think immediately of a remote working team, and absolutely a lot of the time a remote working team would be working in an Agile fashion, but it's important to note that it's not just restricted to those sorts of teams. So with that in mind, what I'd like us to do is a quick Mentimeter. So if you could, you can either go to that link, and I'll just post that in the chat, or you can scan the QR code, or if you go to menti.com and you can type in that number and it will bring you up with the first question. It's in the chat now. Okay, you can scan that QR code if you're doing this on your phone. So what I'd like you to do on the first one, which I'll just bring up on the screen, I'd like you to type in examples of Agile teams that you've worked with maybe, or that you think of when you think of Agile teams working in the NHS. So just give us a team name. I think you can put up to 5 different answers. So if you want to put a few in, pop those in there. And if you're still trying to log in, I hope you can see it's not on my screen because of my controls, but the number to log in is at the top of there. Okay, so I'll just give you a minute or so to do that. Okay. Fab. So lots of different suggestions here. Leadership and OD are in there. A couple of people have mentioned that. HR business partners, absolutely. Quite often in OD and HR, we are perhaps those sort of typical Agile teams that absolutely need to flex, because the teams that we support often work in quite different ways. So I think my own examples, I've delivered TED sessions to night shift teams and to teams at different sites. And we've delivered other learning sessions. We do remote things like this. So I suppose those are really good examples that are relevant to us all, where we're having to flex to meet the needs of our service users. I can see someone else in there has put midwives. Yeah, so it might be a community-based team that are spread out, maybe having to go out across different teams. You mentioned support services in there, clinical site teams, project workers. Yeah, some really good examples there of different ways of team working that will adopt some sort of agile working fashion to flex to meet the needs of their service users. Okay, so I'm going to go on to the second question now. So thinking about those teams that we mentioned there, and thinking about the teams you may have worked with or your own team, which of the TED themes do you think are the most important for an agile working team? So this might be from your own experience, what things have cropped up as maybe a challenge for those teams that work in an agile way, or it might be things that you believe absolutely should be at the forefront when you're trying to work in an agile fashion. So just think you can select just one or two if you want, or I think you can select up to 3 on this one. So just submit what you feel are the most important factors. Okay, fab. So lots of votes for communication. Yeah, I think I see that a lot as well. I think you mentioned in the chat earlier that one of those challenges for an agile working team could be connection and communication. Quite a few people mentioned team engagement. So yeah, it can be a challenge for teams or team members to stay engaged when you're working in agile fashion. So absolutely, it's important to have that focus. And working together is coming out high there as well. But interesting, I think review and celebrate success, team purpose as well. I think it's hard because every team's different and there might be specific teams that have other specific things. But I think what we're seeing here, and this has definitely been my experience as well, that communication is often one of the biggest challenges. Maybe when a team starts working in agile fashion, I think if we all think back to when we maybe first started working remotely, possibly during the pandemic, that was one of the things which was sort of new to us all, communicating in this remote working way. How do we communicate appropriately? How do we make sure we don't over communicate sometimes, because that can just create a lot of noise, particularly for big teams. But how do we do this in a way that's meaningful and works for us in the best way possible? Marvelous, fab. Right, well, I'm going to come back to my slides. Yeah. Okay, so yeah, I think you've identified some good examples there, and I think from my experience, increasingly we're seeing a lot of NHS teams work in more agile ways. So some teams have had to work in an agile manner for years, so it's not necessarily a new thing. We've had things like community teams that worked across different departments or across different sites. And they might be teams who've always adopted some form of agile working practices. But for other teams, the pandemic has definitely accelerated a move towards agile working in recent years. So many teams are adopting more remote working practices that have for many become the new normal for how they connect and collaborate. So even as we put the pandemic behind us and we move further along, I think many teams have stuck with some of those agile working practices because there are benefits, as we identified earlier. It might help with things like work-life balance. It helps us perhaps be more flexible to meet the needs of our service or even our team colleagues as well. But often there are other pressures which are forcing teams to work in this way. So these might be things like financial constraints, might be reductions in staffing, or the changing needs of our service or our service users. Sometimes it might be a drive towards efficiency and productivity, and it's made agile working become more of a necessity, I think, for a lot of teams, because they're thinking of new ways which they can maximize the resource that they have at their disposal. So I pulled this from a bit of research from the Leadership Academy, which I was looking into as part of building up this session. But I was really encouraged to see that what the research was saying was really what we're seeing through our TED data as well. So just to give you, I will share the sort of reference and the link for this with these session notes from today. But just for a bit of context, in 2022, the Leadership Academy found that teams had experienced an unprecedented shift towards agile working. So there were significantly more teams doing it than there were pre-pandemic, as we would imagine. And through exploring the culture of different types of agile working throughout the NHS, they found that it was often influenced by things like the type of service, maybe the size of team, differing locations, and teams being moved around a lot more than they ever were, but also team member preferences were leaning towards agile working practices as well. And I suppose that's something that's changed perhaps in the national culture or international culture, really, in the way organizations work. So across all those different teams that they looked at, these were the three factors which came up as being the most important things for success when agile working. So what they covered was team members needed to feel connected to each other so that they felt more part of something, and they felt that they were sort of working towards something together. And I think that comes back to what a few of you said in the chat before around feeling engaged, feeling part of something bigger than just the task that you're doing. So recognizing how you contribute to wider success. And I think that is of real importance for teams that I've worked with as well, because sometimes it can be hard to establish those links when you're perhaps not working together in the same office all the time, or maybe you don't get that opportunity to communicate regularly. Second point there is that team members needed to have confidence in the capabilities and roles of their colleagues. So this idea of being able to work closely together, even when you're not physically close together, but also understand the roles of other people in your team. And definitely this connects with that TED theme around working together well, and some of our TED resources around understanding the roles of others, understanding the strengths, and where there's learning opportunities as well. A final one on there was the suggestion that teams who work in an agile way need to connect regularly. So it's really important to often revisit your purpose and direction in order to reinforce your strategies, make sure you're all on the same page with where you're heading, and be able to maintain that confidence and accountability as well throughout your team. So when I looked at these, I thought, yeah, absolutely, I agree with them. But actually, a lot of these things I would say are relevant to every single team. So I think when we work with agile teams, it's not just things that are specific to them, but often these things are perhaps become amplified when you work in an agile fashion. So we mentioned about communication, around closeness of relationships, building those connections. I think they become possibly more of an area of focus for teams that work in an agile fashion, just because we're sort of responding to that challenge that agile teams face. So for us, the factors of team engagement, working well together, and having a strong team purpose, they're at the core of what's in TED, and those are those sort of core factors that make up that team effectiveness score as well in TED. So it's really interesting to see how that research backs up some of the other research that we've seen behind TED as well. Sean, would you like to go in?
I think my reflections are that during COVID, the teams did work flexibly, and they did have a greater team purpose. It was Team DBTH at our hospital. We were all one trust working our way through COVID. And I think now we're moving away from the COVID, then it seems that's one thing that I feel that we are losing, that greater purpose.
Yeah, I think that's a really good observation, and I think that's something I saw as well, that teams, when we were working through the pandemic, it was almost as if that team purpose was strengthened, because it was quite clear what we had to do. We were sort of working in adversity, and many teams had this shared common goal. They knew they had to support each other. They knew they were there to sort of manage the pandemic in whatever capacity their team had. And I think you're absolutely right that the challenge for a lot of teams today is that it's less clear what that team purpose might be, because there's a lot of competing purposes or pressures on us and things that we want to achieve together. And I think quite a lot for agile working teams today who have worked together through the pandemic, they're trying to find what is that right balance for us right now. And the answer today might be different than it was 12 months ago, and it might be different in 12 months' time again. So, yeah, totally agree with that. Thanks, Sean. Just from my experience using TED with agile teams, I think I picked out these 3 factors, so slightly different than those factors that were in that research paper, very similar to what you put on our Mentimeter, but for me, definitely communication is that key importance. It's a common challenge for all teams, but for dispersed teams in particular, so those that work in a remote way or work across multiple different sites, maybe they don't get that chance to come together very regularly. It's so important for those teams to be able to really think around how do they maximize those opportunities that they do have. How do they make sure the communication mechanisms they're using, whether it's meetings or through Teams or some other medium, is working in the way that they need it to. And sometimes it's about them asking themselves, what's the best we can do given the drawbacks of the type of work that we do. So, maybe it's not possible to get us all together for a meeting that often, but we can make sure that when we do have that meeting, we get the most out of it if we really think about it, and we do, we really explore how do we make it work for us. Next one is that the way team members work together can often become more unclear for agile working teams. I think when I've done TED for agile working teams, quite often there's this feeling of silo working at a micro level. So everyone will be doing their own tasks, but might not be aware of what tasks others are doing, or might not really appreciate the impact that they're having on colleagues in the team. So quite often having a focus on the way you work together, and I suppose this comes back to communication as well, can be really valuable for those teams that don't get that opportunity to work together too regularly or aren't working together in the same physical space. Definitely. And then final one, review and celebrate success. I see quite often as this is one of the lowest scoring themes for agile working teams. It's often quite a challenge. Again, it's not unique to agile working teams. I think this is something which is a lower scoring one. I think in our TED data it is our lowest scoring theme across all of our trusts, all our different organizations. But in particular for agile working teams, it can become more important to make sure we do give recognition and make sure people do feel connected to the team, and also appreciate how the work that they're doing does help us achieve our goals as a team, or helps connect to the organization's priorities as well. So I think it's interesting to focus on these sorts of things. And again, I've said it a few times, while these things are relevant to every single team, I think they're amplified when we do work in an agile fashion because of the challenges that agile working teams face. So when we think about the factors that I've just described, it's clear that it can be different in different teams, I think, and that might depend on the amount of agile working that you're doing, or the way in which you work, the type of service you provide. But the expectation that many team leaders have, I see, is that they quite often, when you start to work in an agile way, a team leader will set the tone for how they're going to communicate as a team, or what their approach to celebrating success is. And where that can be a real challenge is that when you've got quite a diverse team, or you get new members joining the team, it might not always stay the same. So this is where we see TED as having a real advantage, the continuous improvement approach, and that idea that a team will regularly check in on these themes that are important to make it work, but also that they will involve everyone in that discussion. So they'll give everybody an opportunity to say whether they feel their approach to recognition and celebration is right, whether they feel communication is working for them. And I think those of you that have run TED with teams, you'll recognise that even in teams that do really well with these factors, they still might have quite a diverse views in the team as to what actually is the best way of us communicating, what is the best way for us to give recognition, what are the best ways of us working together. So using something like TED helps teams to regularly check in on whether what they're doing is right for them at this point in time. And definitely, I think over the last few years, many teams will have seen this change at multiple different points as the teams have evolved, as they've learned together, perhaps as new people have joined the team, but also as things like service user preferences have changed, maybe technology's changed as well, different NHS guidance might have changed for some teams. So teams are constantly having to think around, what is it that we're trying to do? What are the things that are impacting on us? And what's the best way that we can do that in our current circumstances? So that absolutely fits in with why we created TED and what we want teams to get out of TED. So with each cycle of TED, it gives teams that opportunity to learn and to build confidence as well. And that shared learning of, okay, we've tried A, B, and C. They work to varying degrees, so now we're going to try something else. And we've learned that together. We understand that, and we've done it based on what our team members thought. So we've been able to bring the team along with us on that journey. So that's where TED can really help in that sort of team development. So to illustrate this, I was thinking about different agile teams that I've worked with, but I think the best example that I've got is actually in my own team. So you'll have met members of my team. You've met Sam and perhaps Louisa and Jude, and we've got a bit of a wider team as well. But just for perspective, when I first joined the team many years ago, now about 7 or 8 years ago, we only had 3 members who worked across different areas such as staff engagement, recognition, retention. And at the time, we all worked in the same office. We had a regular weekly team meeting, as well as the more informal interactions that you can expect when you're a team working in close quarters. So since then, we've grown as a team. So we've had some team members leave, we've had new people join the team, we've had changes in management, changes in responsibilities for people in the team, new work streams that we've taken on board, and different working practices as well. So using TED has helped us navigate those changes that we've had together, because we're a very different team than we were sort of 6 or 7 years ago. What we found is the organisation's expectations of OD has evolved over that time as well. During that time, we've transitioned to, at one point, being 100% remote working during the height of the pandemic. And then over the last few years, we've been finding different balances of working together on site and thinking about, when do we come together, when do we connect virtually, and how do we communicate in different ways to suit our needs as a team. So today we're a team of 6 people in our OD programs team, and we've got an extended relationship with our leadership and OD colleagues who sit sort of alongside our team, and we come together regularly, both virtually and in person. We communicate in a variety of different ways to collaborate, share ideas, to sort of work through challenges that we're facing as well. We've got a range of different team members as well. So we've experienced team members, with some just starting out their career in OD, and we've got colleagues with different backgrounds, from things like education to people with HR backgrounds, someone who used to work in the police force, ex-military experience as well. So lots of different sort of vast diversity in our team, both private and public sector expertise. So I'm describing all these factors because I think our team's been a great example of how we've been able to build on that as we've changed, and TED has been a big part of that for us, because it does create that opportunity to sort of step back and understand, actually, where are we at today, what is working for us, and it helps to make sure we're talking about the right sorts of things, because although each of us in the team will have maybe a slightly different perspective on how well our communication's working, or how well we're working together, what balance of agile working is right for us, using something like TED helps to give us measurable information to decide, actually, we need to work on this because it's beginning to slip from where we were last time, or maybe we're doing really well at something and we want to make sure we keep doing that, even as there are perhaps new changes on the horizon. So TED's been that constant touch point for us to reflect on the journey that we've been on in our team. And each time we enter that process, we get that opportunity to adapt how we work, think around why we do what we do. And this is definitely the case when we think of how we come together, how we communicate, and we ask ourselves that question of, actually, why are we doing this? What is the value we're getting this? Where does it help us do what we're here to do as a team? And that's really what we want teams to get through TED. Okay, so what I'd like to go into next is to go through some examples of tools that you can use with remote working teams. So looking at more specific ways of using TED in a remote working fashion. So firstly, I just wanted to signpost some of the interactive tools that you might use. So we've used a Mentimeter today. You've been using the chat. We can put things like polls in the chat. Microsoft Whiteboard we used on, I think it was our last quarterly deep dive event. So ways you can interact together. So when you're running a virtual feedback session, these can all be really useful ways of making TED tools come to life. And I'll go through some examples and just talk you through how I've used them with agile working teams. Okay, now I've got these on my slides, but I'm going to share my screen and talk you through them because you might be able to see them a little bit better. Okay, so first one that I find I use quite often, or I suggest to agile working teams, is this team visioning tool. And this one is really good for a team who's thinking about their team purpose. And I often find that if a team is unsure where to start with the TED results, whether they're agile working or not, working on that team purpose is a great place to start, because that then, I guess, it sort of gives you that North Star that you head into as a team. And what this team visioning tool does, I'll just scroll down a little bit, then you can get an idea. But it gets team members to think around, I guess, the why of their team. So it's, why are we here? What is the service we're looking to provide? What are the outcomes that we all want from our team? And you can run this in different ways. The way I tend to run this is I'll ask every member of the team to come up with their team vision statement in 12 words or less. And the advantage to that is it keeps it short and concise, so they don't come out with reams and reams of words. But it also helps them to think around, okay, what are the key words that are in there? Is patient in there? And I find most of the time it is. You know, it's thinking around, okay, how do we connect to the patient? What is the way we provide that service to the patient? But also it are things like collaboration in that team purpose, are things like communication in that team purpose. So it's always really interesting to get different team members' views on what that vision is for the team. Another sort of spin you might put on this, and I think this is one of our other TED toolkits, is you might get the team to imagine that they're 12 months in the future and get them to think around, if you're nominated for an award or you see your team's been had a journal article written about them, what would you want that headline to say? And again, in 12 words or less, sum that up. And what you get is, from all the different team members, when you bring those together, you can look at what are the themes that are occurring. And quite often you will get common words that are cropping up again and again. And if you can, as a team, try and boil that down into one, I guess it's sort of a mission statement for a team. So I definitely recommend that one as my first Agile tool recommendation. Next one, and I guess we've thought about the whys in that first exercise. This one, developing team operating principles, is much more focused around the how. So how do we achieve those different things? So this one, it's a one-page exercise, but really it's there to prompt a team discussion around what are the practical things that we need to do, and how can we set that out. So if we set out a list of the things, that the services that we provide as a team, then what would that be? So again, you're getting the team members to generate that, to think about it together. And then what you might want to do as a team is think about maybe prioritizing that, to say, what are the core things we want to do? What are the non-negotiables for our team that we want to achieve? But also, what are the sort of nice to haves, or we'd like to have, or we aspire to as a team? And quite often this can be a really good exercise to do using something like Jamboard or a whiteboard with an Agile team, or use it to build on that last activity. Once you've got your why as a team, then start to think about the how and the practicalities of that. Next example, and I'm sure a lot of you have used a version of this. I quite often get feedback that Stop, Start, Do Differently is one of the favorite toolkits. Very, very simple, this one. Essentially, it's just got some coaching questions to ask a team. And this, again, is a good one that you could do just in the chat of a remote session. You could do it on a whiteboard activity or using a Mentimeter or something like that. But essentially what you're asking the team is, what is it about the way that we're currently working that you feel we should stop doing? So what is perhaps undermining our success as a team? Again, it's a great thing to build on that why conversation. But the next thing you might ask the team, what do we want to start doing? So what are new things we maybe want to try? Maybe a new way of doing things, or a brand new thing altogether. So you'd ask the team to put ideas down on that. And then maybe there are some things which you do want to keep doing, but you want to do slightly differently. So are there things which you want to maybe tweak your approach to it? So there are lots of different versions of this. Sometimes you might use it to focus on communication and think around, what is it about our team meetings that we need to stop, start, and do differently. Sometimes you might use it about recognition or about a particular project and be really specific. But again, I find this one is a great one for remote working teams to look at, or Agile working teams. Next one, I put this one on as an example. But what I really wanted to refer to is, we've got a suite of toolkit resources which are all geared towards team meetings. Now, there are things like sample meeting agendas, which teams can pick and choose things that they want to put in their own meeting agendas. This one is just an idea of things you might want to consider for a team meeting. And really, I think a meeting is something which is quite personal to every team, really, because they will be slightly different. Some teams will take formal minutes, so they'll have a set agenda, they'll do it in that way. Some teams might prefer a much more open and fluid structure. But what we wanted to do with our TED resources was really just prompt that conversation for teams to ask the questions around, do we need a formal team agenda? Do we need to have minutes from our meetings? And by asking yourselves those sorts of questions, you can elicit that thoughtfulness from team members around, actually, what are we looking to get from our meetings? Are they still as useful as they were when we set them up? What I find quite often, again, this is relevant to all teams, not just Agile teams, but quite often when you originally set up a meeting, it will absolutely serve the purpose that it's set up to. But the longer time goes on, the more teams can drift away from what the actual purpose of that meeting was. And that just happened naturally over time. But again, it's one of those areas where it's important to every so often check back in and think, actually, is it still serving that purpose? Is the reason we perhaps set this meeting up last year, is that still a priority for us? Or has it shifted in some way, so we want to change the way we talk about it? Or is it something which we were happy to do remotely 18 months ago, and now we've decided actually we need to be together, we need to connect around the subject, and we need to think around how do we make it work for us? So not just this one, but our entire suite of meeting resources. And then last one, I'll just scroll along. This one's a Word document. So I've put on, might be a little bit small on your screen, but our SWOT analysis tool. So again, with 2 or 3 different SWOT analysis tools, but I often find this is a great one again for an Agile working team to explore that subject of Agile working. So really think around, what are the strengths around Agile working for us? What are perhaps weaknesses to that? So let's identify those challenges so we understand how we can overcome them. Where are there opportunities to maybe work in a slightly different way? Maybe try out some different technology, or maybe come together on a different frequency than we used to? And also, where are the threats to that? So is there something that's likely to change in the team, or is there something about the service that we provide that makes it really difficult to connect in the way that we'd like to in a perfect world? So again, a SWOT analysis, very commonly used tool, but this can be a great one again in a remote sort of session. I think we used it in last month's quarterly deep dive, so you could use it on a whiteboard, get team members to put up their ideas, and then use that to explore your different topics. Okay, so just some examples there of tools which I've used with Agile working teams, but also ones that are my sort of go-to references. So I'm just going to come back to my slides, but I'd just like to throw that question out. Are there any other tools that you've used with Agile working teams, or what are your go-to tools that you might suggest for a team that's maybe struggling with the challenges of Agile working? Any thoughts on that? Oh, I hope you're all still there. Yeah. And any tools you've used which you think could be good in an Agile setting? I see some of you typing away. Okay, so just while you're typing away, what I'm going to do is pop in the feedback link for today's session, so you can be filling that in when you go as well. Has anyone used those sorts of tools? Any experience using those tools that I've suggested there? Oh, it might be all new ones. Okay. So, thanks, Justine. You put in, you have used some of those tools plus some of the working with other teams. Yeah, I guess that's a good point to think around. You know, quite often Agile working teams will work with others in different ways. So, yeah, definitely, I think that's a great idea. Chloe, would you like to go in?
Yeah, just to say that the visioning resource, we use that within our OD team and found that really useful. I think especially where we'd had, we all work remotely predominantly, and we'd had quite a few changes to sort of members of the team. So that was really useful just to kind of regroup everyone and ground everyone and kind of set us off on a really good footing for kind of working together going forward, and also help with kind of what you were saying about, you know, understanding that wider purpose about why we're here, and sort of how that vision also contributes to the vision of our sort of the team that's the next level up from us. That type of thing, I think, really helped, as I say, just to sort of pull us all together and sort of ground us.
Excellent. Yeah, I think that's a good example of how you can use it. Sort of, I always think of it, it's like it's zooming out. You're looking at the bigger picture, right? And to some extent, you're disregarding the sort of day-to-day things. You're thinking, oh, what's that broader picture? How do we fit in with the broader organisation as well? So it does give you that space to think about that. And often I find when I use that tool with teams that can be quite motivating and empowering for team members as well, to really just get back to thinking, actually, what are we here to do? What's our core focus? And how do we make sure everything we do sort of leads into that, and we keep that at front and centre of what we do? But yeah, great. Thanks for sharing, Chloe. Justine, would you like to go in?
Yeah, I just wanted to explain a little bit about my comment there, Lee, because I work for Serona Care and Health. We're a community health provider. Almost all of our teams are dispersed, and most people do work on their own all day. And so I guess we have quite a natural focus on how do we ensure team communication and coordination when almost everybody is in what we're calling an agile team. And so when we've used TED with those teams, yeah, we have definitely focused on the ones that you've mentioned there. Team communication is really key, and how they work together. And in common with that, I think a lot of teams, reviewing and celebrating success is just something we're not very good at in the NHS, is it? We're all action orientated, and we never stop to actually celebrate what we have achieved. But yeah, the one that comes up a lot in our organisation, where we've got so many agile and dispersed teams, is about working with others and in other teams, because we naturally think, you know, I don't see my team very often, and we need to put things in place to ensure that we're all coordinated and communicating, and where information is kept and how it's disseminated and things. So the team itself may work quite efficiently, but it is quite inward looking, and it doesn't necessarily have that infrastructure to work well with other teams who are also all quite inward looking, because they're all similar in that way. So I just thought it was worth mentioning, because I think it is a bit of a different scenario there.
I think that's a really good example, and I think quite often when you do work in a remote based team, it's harder to really picture where you sit in the broader organisation. And quite often, you know, you might have really good agile working practices in your own team, so you feel connected to those immediately around you. But that broader interactions, it's much harder to visualize, because you're not seeing it all the time, or quite often it's a remote thing, or maybe there's some members of your team who have those connections with others, but you yourself don't. And I think, again, it's not something which is unique to agile working teams. I think we talk about that idea of silo working quite a lot. When I run my accreditation training, a lot of people say that silo working is a big challenge for teams in the NHS. So it's not unique to agile teams, but it's definitely something which can be a real challenge for agile teams as well. So I think you're right. Those tools on just sort of reviewing what those relationships are with other teams can help team members in an agile team understand where they fit in, how they contribute. I think it can help teams think around, how do we make sure we're consistent across our approach? If we're dealing with lots of other teams, how do we make sure we're dealing with people in the same way? I think good example from our organisation, something we've experienced in the OD team, is sometimes you'll get teams who will ask multiple members of our team for support, and it's really important that we're connected, because if we're not, we might find that maybe I'm going in helping them with the TED session, and someone else in my team is doing some coaching with some members of the team, and then someone else in the team is helping support them on recognition. And if we weren't sort of connected in how we work, then we might be silo working ourselves and not recognise how we're sort of interacting and streamlining that process of how we work with other teams. But yeah, that's a great example. Thanks, Justine. Okay, fab. Yeah, I can see a few more coming in the chat. So Chloe, you mentioned the Team Canvas tool. I think, again, yeah, that's a really good one for team visioning. And again, I think those sort of team purpose style exercises can always be a great starting point for a team. If, particularly with your first TED, if a team's unsure where to go first, think about that team purpose, because if you can get that right, then the idea should be that all the other themes within TED sort of work towards that common purpose and get that right. So yeah, some great points. Thanks everyone for sharing. Okie dokie, so we are just about coming up to the end of today's session. I've put a feedback form in, so if you do get a couple of minutes, please do fill that in. So just to sort of summarise the key points from today, real key takeaways I wanted to get across really is that agile working is becoming more and more prevalent, and I think most teams in the NHS do work in some manner of agile practice, whether they're remote working or not. They'll adopt some form of agile working. Engagement is even more of a priority for agile teams because building those relationships can be a challenge. Communication can be more difficult, so it's much more important for those sorts of teams that they really do be purposeful in how they address some of these topics. But also that the TED toolkit can be adapted to meet the needs of those teams. And I think most of the TED tools, we've tried to keep them in a way that's accessible to different types of teams. But for agile working teams, there are definite benefits from having that opportunity to check in, ask questions around those key topics and be able to work on them together. Okay, so last little bit, just a bit of signposting to things that are coming up. So those of you that have been on our most recent coffee catch up, I'll have mentioned that we are due to have some site maintenance for some updates and improvements we're making to the TED website. So just want to make that clear. I will send an email out following today's session, but on the Thursday, the 23rd of May, the site might be a little bit intermittent or down between 9 AM and 12. So our developers have said it probably won't be for the whole of that time. They'll do it on our test site first, so hopefully the site won't be down too long. But I guess we want to put this on your radar just in case you know of any teams who are planning the TED feedback on that day. Make sure they download the report beforehand, or if you're looking to use it on that day, just be mindful that the site might be a little bit intermittent that morning. Other thing to signpost you to, we're doing a live presentation at the Duo-D NHSE conference, which is in Manchester on the 14th of May. If you're going along to that, it'd be great to see you, and I'd love to meet you in person and have a chat with you. So it'd be great if you are going along. That's on Tuesday, the 14th of May in Manchester. So Sam, Louisa and myself will be there, and we might have some goodies as well. I'm working on some TED branded merchandise and things that we can give away. Unfortunately, what that does mean is that next month's coffee catch up, we're going to have to send that down because that was scheduled for that day. So I'll have a chat with NHSE and tell them to look at our calendar before they book these things in the future. But yeah, so just to put that on your radar. What that does mean is our next one of these events, we've got a lunch and learn on the 24th of May. From 12 till 1. That's going to be around the wraparound process with TED. So thinking around after team leader training, what are the other ways that you can support teams as they go through their TED cycle? Our next coffee catch up will be in June on the 11th between 11 and 12 noon. And we've got a quarterly deep dive in June as well, where we'll have that 2-hour session. We'll go into a bit more depth with some case examples as well. Okay, so that's everything from me. So thank you all very much for contributing. It's been lovely to see you all, and we'll see you all next time. Thanks a lot, everyone. Cheers,
Thank
bye.
you. Thanks, Lee.
Bye.
Bye.